cells beginning to appear.
If you put a pretty hefty subsidy for the solar panels in the first couple of years, and then you taper off the subsidy until by the 10th year there's no subsidy. But every year, more mass-produced solar panels bring down the cost, so that then by the end of 10 years, the cost is the same as it would be with the subsidy, but now there is no subsidy. And so we went ahead and modeled our program after that. We called it the Million Solar Roof Plan, obviously looking to put at least 1 million roofs, cover them with solar, and then finally had the law passed in 2006 that made it the law. And now there's $3.2 billion in incentives out there for smart Californians in business or their homes to go ahead and put those panels up.
I was just hoping to break even, comparing the energy bills to our old house to the new house. And so on our worst month, where we're using the most energy, we're about 80% less than our old house. And this house is about a third bigger, and it's 2 stories. If we have generated more energy than what we have used, then we actually would get a refund check. Now, because we have a big home and we've got 3 kids, we have not gotten a refund. But the homes in our development where maybe you've got a smaller family and maybe both the husband and wife work, I know that they have gotten refunds, which to me is really unbelievable.
This new industry of alternative green energy here in California, it has been said by the University of California, Berkeley, in a study that they conducted, will generate over 14,000 jobs. But it also lessens our dependency on foreign oil in a way that ultimately could make us energy independent.
These new technologies, solar and wind and biomass and fuel cells, are coming down in price exactly when fossil fuels are coming up in price. So that's a good start. But does it mean that we've won? It definitely does not, because our global demand for oil is still increasing. Right now, the renewables aren't even keeping up with the growth in the energy markets. We're not supporting research and development in renewables at all well. We're not playing a leadership role in the world on climate. We're playing a follower role. Well, the countries that have taken a leadership role are seeing some fairly dramatic economic returns. Germany had no wind industry to speak of 10 years ago. Now Germany has almost half of the world's wind power installed. Japan was the leader on solar photovoltaics, and they really pushed a set of programs to get solar in place. And when you look at patents in the scientific journals, the engineering journals on solar, Japanese universities, companies are way up there. Both those technologies, of course, were essentially developed in the United States. So it's not just that we've fallen behind, it's that we've essentially done the hard work, the early R&D, and then we let other countries commercialize. So the real issue isn't just does the market open the door for renewables, it's do our policy mechanisms put renewables at the head of the line. We either then discovered that this was the decade of change, or this was the decade of one state tried to change and the government held them back.
For California, being held back is not an option. Having seen firsthand its voracious economy threaten the very way of life that is the envy of many, taking a leadership role is not just altruism, it is a responsibility. Having the hindsight of making mistakes, California knows that the economies of being environmentally conscious are not only feasible, but actually smart.
Some people say, well, why California? This won't work unless it's worldwide. Well, you got to start somewhere. And if you don't start in the most environmentally progressive state in the country, then why should other states, like Florida, for example, or even places like Texas, ever decide that this is the right path for them?
You know, I think that, the policies in California apply to California. I'm often asked, shouldn't we have a renewable fuel standard? And our attitude on that is that particular idea is not a bad one, but it ought to be handled locally. It ought to be handled by state. Different states have different access to renewable fuels. Some have wind, some have solar energy, some have ethanol, but most don't have everything. And so it has to be tailored to deal with it on a localized basis.
I'm disappointed to hear federal legislators saying that we should let this just be a state-by-state thing. What we have right now in this country is a federal clean air standard that works quite well, and a few states, notably California, has applied for an exemption to make the air cleaner. And having one or two leaders makes a lot of sense because it allows a state that's got the guts to do it to experiment and find out what works and what doesn't, and let the federal government come along and pick the things that work well.
Oil industry has spent $186 million over the last decade or so on political contributions to the congressional and presidential campaigns. And for that, they've gotten back $1,000 for every single dollar they've invested in political contributions. So as long as that happens, we're likely to continue to see the status quo.
We have relied to a large degree, not entirely, but to a large degree on voluntary compliance. We have a lot of companies that have signed up and are participating in this program. We monitor it. So I think we've done what I think is the appropriate thing, and we'll see what happens in the future as we learn more.
Last time I checked, we don't have voluntary compliance to the speed limits or to murder laws or all manner of things in this country where we've figured out what we think the minimum standard of behavior would be. And now that President Bush in the 2007 State of the Union address has said global warming is a problem, once you've made that admission, which is way too long in coming, but it's finally been made, to then turn around and not set federal standards is hypocritical.
The voters, however, across this country are becoming more and more aware of this horrific phenomenon called global warming, and they're beginning to say our government must do something about it. Because you'll never get China to the table, you will never get India to the table until and unless we put our money where our mouth is here in this country.
The naturalist John Muir once said, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe." First-hand mistakes made in California have taught us the environment is linked to economics and in turn is connected to people. The big question is, will the leaders of the federal government and developing nations see this as a lesson or just another California idiosyncrasy?
It started in 2003 when candidate Arnold Schwarzenegger decided to become a candidate for governor and got elected in the recall. And when he announced his candidacy, within about 48 hours, he and I sat down and started drafting his environmental action plan. It was very meaty, very detailed about all the things we wanted to do in the environment. And in 2005, the governor announced our targets for reducing greenhouse gases, which now are the law, thanks to AB 32 that was passed in 2006.
You really need the legislature to provide the framework and the leadership, and you need a committed executive branch that does the follow-through. And we have that. It's not always perfect, and we have disagreements and differences. But we have more agreement between the governor and the legislature, the NGOs, and some of the business community than we have agreement with our colleagues at the federal level.
The fact that we've succeeded, we've passed the right legislation, means that everyone who's involved gets to take credit. And the governor certainly played a role. The governor was the focal point for getting the discussions to happen. But I think the real issue is you had some lawmakers who absolutely put it on the line. You had people like Fran Pavlia saying, this is what I'm going to focus my term in the Assembly on.
The United States is 5% of the world's population, but emits 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions, uses almost 25% of the oil supply in the world. We have to be a part of the solution. I think California sort of likes pushing the agenda, and I can only hope that perhaps with a different administration in Washington, D.C., that our country can work together and do our fair share to take on what most people think is the most important environmental issue of the 21st century.